All right. Do you have the ability to share your screen?
Yeah, let's.
All right, perfect. So I think we'll probably
Okay.
just give people a few minutes to arrive. And then I'll give a short introduction and then you'll be okay to get started.
Great, good.
Would you be willing to share in not presenter mode, just so we can have full screen?
Yes.
Perfect.
Hang on. Not presenter. How's that?
Yeah, yep.
Hang on. um, Shall I stop sharing?
I think you should be okay to share if you just go into slideshow at the top ribbon.
Top ribbon. Here.
Slideshow.
Which one's that?
To the right.
This one?
Nope.
No, so it's like in the home insert, that's that panel.
The one that
Okay.
says home. This one?
No, like keep going right.
Yeah. It says home, insert, draw, design, and then to the right is slideshow.
Can you see my, I mean, I can do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, except it's in presenter still. I'm just wondering.
All right, I'll stop sharing for now, and then I can share when you want me to start speaking. How's that?
Okay. Alrighty. I think there's still people filtering in, but I can get started on the introduction so that we can get started on our talk today. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. AIOG is excited to host Dr. Fiona Watt. Dr. Watt obtained her DPhil from the University of Oxford and did her postdoc at MIT. She's currently the director of the Center for Stem Cells and Regenerative Medicine at King's College London. In addition, she serves as the executive chair of the Medical Research Council in the UK. And the major interest of Dr. Watt's lab is in the interplay between internal and external factors in the regulation of stem cell fate. But today, she is here to talk to us about the importance of science communication. So welcome, Dr. Watt. And I'm just going to remind the audience to please feel free to add some questions in the chat box. I can moderate our discussion at the end. And thank you, Dr. Watt, for joining us. Take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, what mode am I in?
It looks good. You're all set.
That's all I need to know.
Perfect.
Okay, well, many thanks for the invitation. I'm sorry that the last presentation was somewhat truncated, and let's just hope this goes more smoothly. But I'm really glad to talk to you. I am based in this little tower here, which is Guy's Hospital in central London, next to this very large tower here called Shard. And we have Tower Bridge over here. So it was interesting to be asked to talk about science communication, because it's something that I have experience of in a lot of different contexts. So I'm going to give you some examples, and they're based really on different phases in my career. So the topics that I'm going to cover are working for a non-profit organization, which can expose you to different, gives you different opportunities to communicate your science. Signing up to advise government, and that might influence legislation or provide, be an expert witness on topics of interest. Art science collaborations are something that are also, they're different, but they're very interesting and enriching for everybody involved. Public engagement, which is about sharing your science with the public. Patient involvement, which actually can involve getting patients to be involved in co-creating a research project. And then I'll wrap up with a little bit on lessons I've learned. So I was a postdoc at MIT, and I hadn't been there for very long when I went back to Oxford to see my thesis advisor, and he said, "Oh, I've got a job that you might be interested in." My friend Helen Muir runs an arthritis research institute, and she's looking for a cell biologist. So without really going on the job market at all, I ended up setting up my first lab in a little institute in London, which is funded by a charity which is currently called Versus Arthritis. I say that because I can't even remember what it was called. It was probably called the Arthritis and Rheumatism Research Council when I started. But this was interesting because we had good core support from the nonprofit, and I was able to get funding for other aspects of my research. But I remember after a couple of years, Helen Muir, the director, said that she had invited some lady members of the House of Lords to the Institute, and she wanted me to volunteer to sit with these ladies and knit squares for a blanket. And I have to say, I was incensed. I thought, why are the men not being asked to knit squares? And how on earth are we going to raise serious amounts of money by knitting? But I think sometimes you can be more generous as time goes on. And I do think that that experience of contributing to fundraising for an organization that supports your research is a good and valid thing to do. After a few years in the Institute, which was funded by the arthritis charity, I moved to a much bigger research institute, which is funded by a cancer charity called Cancer Research UK. In fact, the institute that I worked is now part of the Francis Crick Institute in London. So it's a very big enterprise. And I think my first experience of talking about my research there was when I had to accept a gift of a check from a couple who had lost their son to testicular cancer. And even then, testicular cancer was a cancer which was completely curable. And I was so struck by the pain of this couple who had lost their adult son to the disease, and that they had felt a way to express their grief was by fundraising. And over the many years that I worked in that cancer institute, being exposed to people who have experienced the disease and have lost loved ones to it was very focusing for my research. We would often host visitors, and I can remember once showing a group of volunteers around, and they were speaking to somebody in my lab, and they said, well, when you do an experiment, how many times do you repeat it before you believe the results? That's not a question you expect to get from members of the public or volunteers. And I was struck really by the insightful question, but also how kind these supporters were to much younger people who were doing science. And so I think that discipline of explaining your research to supporters is a very good one. At the time, a lot of my work relates to the skin, and I would often be asked to contribute to the goals of the charity by explaining the dangers of excess sun exposure. And this would, because I was working in London, this would frequently involve an unexpected heat wave, being asked to go live on TV to talk about the dangers of sun exposure, and then by the time the film crew showed up, it would be pouring with rain. So it wasn't necessarily the happiest experience. But I do think that if you are working for an organization that is dedicated to eradicating or managing a particular disease, being willing not just to explain to supporters what you're doing, but get over more public messages is really good. I think the one thing that I came not to like about working for the organization really was the fundraising. You can see a picture of me here warming up for a 5K Race for Life, which has been very successful in raising money for the charity. But I remember I started doing it because I didn't like the fact that the women scientists were tending not to take part in the race. It tended to be the more administrative staff. But then as time went on, I think it's good to promote women in science in that sort of venue. But the line between fundraising and promoting your research was not always completely clean. So I think that for me was one aspect of working for a nonprofit that I had to come to deal with. Now I want to shift to a completely different topic, but it's one that is equally important, where communicating your science is, I would argue, it's a responsibility. And this is, in any country, a government will want advice about science. In our country, it's very rare for somebody who has been elected to Parliament, as we call it, to have any science training at all. And so really being able to be a trusted advocate for science is very important. And my first experience of that was at the time when it became clear that you could grow cells from human from human embryos, discarded embryos from in vitro fertilization. And for obvious reasons, there were a number of people who were concerned about the ethics of that, perhaps from a religious background, who did not support, as a matter of principle, the destruction of an embryo to create a cell line. And I was very involved in these discussions around the world. But what was good about doing it in Britain was that we had existing legislation which regulated in vitro fertilization procedures. And so when it came to talking to Parliament about regulating embryonic stem cell research, we had a good foundation there. And actually the legislation around that was an extension of the existing legislation, and it led to the creation of something called the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. I remember just as, working with people who had suffered from cancer, talking to people and respecting their concerns about stem cell research was very important. I think it's wrong to brush people's concerns aside, and I think it's really important to listen and to support the idea of legislation which would regulate the way the science is done. A few years after that, I had a phone call. I was on holiday actually in Rhodes in August, and asked if I would be an expert witness to something called the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee. And this was a very interesting experience. So in Britain, we have an elected house, which is called the Houses of Parliament, and then people who are nominated to be in the second chamber, the House of Lords. So the House of Lords don't need to bother about being re-elected. They can take their time. They're often selected to be in the Lords because they have deep expertise in their careers in particular aspects. And certainly the people who were on the Science and Technology Select Committee were very good. And they were a part of government, but they wanted to understand what the opportunities were for regenerative medicine. So this was a bit different from helping to regulate stem cell research. This was looking at the opportunities. And I would have a lot of free rein to invite expert witnesses. All of the evidence was freely available. The sessions were recorded, and at the end a report was written up, which I think led to some benefits for regenerative medicine in this country, in particular by explaining that we needed good ways to regulate it, to make it so that the regulation supported regenerative medicine rather than being an obstacle. And the House of Lords, this committee, it sits regularly. It tackles a number of topics. Most recently, healthy aging. The government has made a commitment to increase the healthy life of British citizens. And the House of Lords turned around and said, well, how exactly are you going to do that? And it was very interesting to go back into the committee, this time giving evidence rather than being the expert witness. This is not to everybody's taste. It can be quite scary to do this, but I think if you're offered the opportunity to advise government, it's a good thing to do, because if you don't offer advice, you don't want somebody who has no knowledge of the science stepping in to offer advice. So now I want to change to other aspects of research and communicating your science. And one of the areas that has interested me for a long time is what I would call when art and science collide. I happen to really like modern art. And during the brief period over the summer when London was out of lockdown, I rushed to the Tate Modern to see an Andy Warhol exhibition. One of the reasons I really like modern art is I like to know the story behind the artist. And for me, the juxtaposition of Andy Warhol's art and mementos of his life, including 3 of his wigs, just made it such an exciting experience to have. Many times, modern artists will draw from science. An example would be a man called Damien Hirst, who's famous for exhibiting pickled sharks, which if you have worked in a zoology museum, it's not really a big deal. But to try as a scientist to understand what an artist is trying to communicate is really good. I think sometimes when the art is self-consciously scientific, it's not necessarily the best art. But having said that, you can have a lot of fun. And a couple of years ago, members of my lab, this is Christina and Calais, were involved in an exhibition at Science Gallery London, which was about growing body parts. The artist's conception was that if you could generate heat, which could maintain 37 degrees centigrade, so body temperature, you would be able to grow stem cells. And here you can see Christina putting her cells into something called the compostubator or something like that. The idea here was that a compost heap would generate enough heat for the cells to grow. And then this one was using the energy of bees to reach the temperatures to grow the cells. Neither of these really would be a way of growing stem cells that I would advocate. I thought this one was particularly tragic because the artists wanted the bees to get fresh air. So you can see the window here, there was a little tube so that bees that wanted fresh air could go out. But it was really cold outside. And so what happened was the bees would go down the tube and die. So it's a bit of fun. Is it high art? I would say no. But the mutual learning from artists and scientists working together is really good. I was very fortunate that some of my funding comes from the Wellcome Trust. And the Wellcome Trust has been interested for many years in promoting public engagement. And I was able, as part of my research grant, to get funding to employ Jessica Sells. And she became the public engagement officer for our department, the Centre for Stem Cells and Regenerative Medicine. Actually, she was funded to work part-time. I noticed after a couple of months, she was looking really tired, and it turned out to make ends meet. She was working nights in a bar. So we now pay her to work full-time in the department, partly funded by Wellcome and partly by other grants. But Jess has really transformed the way we work. And that's partly because she has worked previously in labs, so she's very scientifically literate. She's really interested, as it happens, in poetry, and she has a lot of friends in the art community. So really, I gave Jess absolutely free range to do whatever she wanted. And some of her projects that are illustrated here. So we asked scientists to donate pictures of stem cells or their experiments, which could be turned into an embroidery project. And we've hosted a number of events, which we call Stitch in STEM, where people come to do craft work based on a scientific theme. We forced all of our PhD students to, as part of their projects, to contribute to a brochure that you can download from our website, which is about explaining our research to members of the public. And it has a lot of interesting content. It's got puzzles that are interesting to do. But I think the act of creating that was very, very positive for the scientists. And I do hope that people who've used it like it. We are taking part in an exhibition this summer, which was supposed to be in real life, as we call it now, but it's virtual. And we've have a project which we call Growing New Body Parts. And this is trying to recreate a kind of a stem cell soup. Because we're going online, we're hoping that we can send the kits for making this slime to various people, get them to film themselves making it, because I think this will engage the public. And one of the things I've learned from Jess is that you might do a public facing event and you might think it's gone really well, but you don't really know unless you evaluate it. And so one of the things that Jess has taught us is that it's very important to evaluate what we're doing or have a strategy for that right at the start. So when we're designing a project, we want to know, how are we going to know if it is working, and how can we change course if it's not? We want to know what value our project has had, and we want to learn from that so that we can get better in future. And I've just copied some materials from some of the online resources that we've provided for children during the pandemic when schools have been closed. And we ask them what they've learned, and you can see here, very pleasingly, they've drawn a scientist who happens to be a woman. But this really feels not just it's not a two-way transactional thing. We've got the students, we've got public, we've got artists all involved in discussing our research and making it better. Of course, social media is very important, and we do a number of different things here. So thanks to Jess, we're very active bloggers. We run a seminar series called Stem Cells at Lunch, and we use that event. It's every 2 weeks. We get one of our students or postdocs to interview the speaker, and they can talk about anything they like. But providing those blogs are probably more science-facing, but it's a great resource, and amazingly, we've clocked up well over 100 of these blogs. We are active on Instagram and Twitter, and this also provides a way for our colleagues who've left the lab, for example, who are in the lab, and the sort of diaspora of scientists who are interested in stem cell research to come together. Last June, during the lockdown period, we did a project which is called Recreate Science. And here we partnered scientists with artists from a particular studio, and then worked together to explore what it means to be creative as an artist or a scientist. So the art science theme is quite strong in what we do. Another thing that we have is it's a YouTube channel, and this really starts, I would say, with my friend and colleague Bridget Hogan at Duke University. Bridget was coming to give a seminar several years ago, and as usual, she met students and postdocs, and I said, well, how did you get on? And she said, well, they were very good, but they didn't know how to do an elevator pitch. I had no idea what an elevator pitch was, but it turned out getting in the elevator, you've got 2 minutes to pitch what you're doing to somebody who might fund it. And I took that opportunity to film a series of elevator pitches, which was actually part of a promotional video for our research. And it was really surprising that some of the most articulate scientists found it really, really difficult to do an elevator pitch on camera, and others were complete naturals at it. And because we have a very diverse community of scientists, having scientists from all over the world and from all different backgrounds talking on our YouTube channel about what they do is not only promoting the science, but it's also showing that you can come from very different backgrounds and be a scientist. So it's quite fun to go back to the YouTube channel and see the different things that we've done, see how people have got older and lost a bit of hair or gone grey. But it is a very easy thing to do, and I think is very valuable. Another thing that we've been involved in a lot is encouraging school children to come to the labs to learn about research. And the particular project that you can see here is children who are rescuing a baby who's got a skin wound by grafting some cultured stem cells onto the lesion. This was a great project, but we did have one little girl who thought the artificial blood was real and became very faint. So we always have to be really careful. You always have to be careful when you have children in the lab. They have to be supervised, but we have to realize that different people have different sensitivities. This particular project is one that I really love because it's run by an organization called Native Scientists. And the premise of this is that if you are from a family where English is not your first language, learning science in school in English is just a further obstacle to appreciating it. So we host events where the event is run in a language which is not English, and we communicate what we're doing in that language. And we often, especially if we do it on a Saturday, we bring the parents in as well. So in fact, those children are all Portuguese, and the stem cell repair of the baby was done in Portuguese. And I think that is a really nice thing to be able to do, to take that language obstacle away from communicating science. This picture also is of school children. These were from a local school in London. I happen to know their teacher, and she was desperate to be able to lay on a nice day trip for the children that would promote science. And we were incredibly welcoming, not least because we wanted to test on the children some of our ideas for exhibits. I honestly can't tell you what this experiment was, but we learned so much from having the children there for the day. We tried out the slime that we were making, and by the end of the day, when the children left, we were absolutely exhausted, but we had, I'm sure, got as much out of the event as the children had. I told you that evaluation is very important, and this slide just pulls out a document that you can get on our website. In October, we were asked by something called the Mayor's Fund. So this is the Lord Mayor of London, wanted us to run events for children from these different schools that you can see here. And of course, we wanted to evaluate whether it had been successful. And to publish this, I think, has been really useful, because that way we can share what we've learned with people anywhere in the world who would like to understand how best to communicate their science. Now, I'm almost finished, but I want to turn to a completely different way or area in which science communication is important. And this actually relates to a long-standing battle, if you like, between the Medical Research Council, so the funding agency that I run, and the community of patients affected by chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis. And what had happened was that more than 10 years ago, a clinical trial had been carried out called the PACE trial, which presented evidence to suggest that in patients suffering from CFS-ME, some form of graded exercise might be beneficial. Some members of the community took great offense because they felt that this did not respect their view that CFS-ME is, if you like, a real disease. It's not it's nothing to do with your mind. And so the people who had conducted the trial were subjected over many years to very, very hostile interactions with this community. And by the time I joined the MRC in 2018, it was clear that something had to be done, because people did not want to research CFS-ME because they didn't want the grief. They didn't even necessarily want to categorize what patients were suffering from because it was such a toxic environment. And so we essentially tried to call a truce, and we said we will fund research co-created with the relevant charities. This is one of them shown up here. And I have to say that since then, things have really gone a lot better. The two charities were involved in putting together an application, which has been to look at whether there's anything to do with the genetic background of an individual, so their genotype, which might influence the course of the disease. At the same time, our agency that gives advice on treatments has looked again at what the symptoms are, so how to define this disease. And this has been, I think, a good outcome to a situation which had over the years really got out of control. Of course, the really difficult thing now is that many people who have had COVID-19 are reporting long-term problematical symptoms. And so in a way, it's a good thing that we funded research which looks at genotype, the genetic basis, if there is one for this disease. But I can predict, well, we've already started to fund research into long COVID. But I do think talking to patients, getting their representatives involved in designing the research has to be the way that we should go forward. So if I were to summarize some of the benefits to scientists of communicating with the public, I would say it forces you to understand and explain your own research in a broad context. Giving a live TV or radio interview is really frightening, at least for me. I don't like being asked to quote facts. I used to always panic, you know, how many people in the UK suffer from skin cancer, those sorts of questions. And because we tend to be quite precise, we don't like to be drawn to give very general answers. But I can promise you, just as undergraduate teaching gives you a better grasp of your research, explaining your research in a broad context really helps. It does give you opportunities to gain new skills and pursue other interests. I've talked about art and poetry, but really the sorts of connections you can make through science communication are important. And I always say, whenever you do an event like this, just record it on your CV, because when the time comes for you to look for another job, it's no bad thing if you're pursuing an academic career, but it's a great thing if you are wanting to pursue another line of work. And I'll never forget one of my PhD students, Christine Weber, had an offer of a postdoc position, and she said, I don't really want to do that. I'm more interested in science editing. And I said, well, you need to have shown that you've got some expertise there. And completely unknown to me, Christine had been translating information about stem cells into her native language, which is German, for a science communication website. And she was able to walk into a maternity cover post at Nature, and she's now one of the editors for Nature Cell Biology. So just making sure that if you have those interests, you pursue them and you put them on your CV is good. And of course, meeting new people is always really interesting. I think it enriches our lives as well as our science. So my conclusions would be, when it comes to science advocacy and communications, there are some key considerations. You need to know in advance what message you want to convey. You need to understand who your target audience are. And I would argue, in my experience, the stance should always be that it's a collaboration rather than being antagonistic or defensive. It's really important to establish trust with journalists. We're very fortunate in Britain that we have an organization called the Science Media Centre, which really facilitates that trust. And if they feel that if the Science Media Centre feels we've let them down and not been open, they will tell us. But we know that we can trust them, that we won't be put in a situation in which we'll feel the science is compromised. When it comes to the level of language you should use to explain science, most people would say that you should use language that a 14-year-old would understand. So it's important not to really dumb down what you're saying, but just think about the vocabulary that would interest a 14-year-old, and you will have got it right for an adult audience. It's really important not to underestimate the intelligence of your audience. One thing I find in Britain is that, at least pre-COVID, the discussion of science was really pretty basic. And yet, at the same time, the public was very interested in medical programs, which would describe complex operations alternatives. So there was a real disconnect there. And I definitely would respect the intelligence of your audience. And then the last thing that I would say, and I'm going to say this with feeling, is that you should beware off-the-cuff remarks. And I say that with feeling because a few years ago, I was really embarrassed by this headline in one of our newspapers, The Times. And the background to this was that it was the time of the Me Too movement. And this journalist, Rhys Blakely, phoned me up because he wanted to test, run past some comments that a female colleague had made. And the comments were completely appropriate. And I said, yes, you know, this, you've got the story right. But then just as he was about to hang up, he said, oh, have you ever experienced anything like this? And I said, oh, yes, of course, all the time. You know, I'm often, if a male scientist isn't going to hit me, I've experienced being, having someone not speak to me for months or years. And I hung up. I didn't think anything about it. But then the next morning, really early, he called me up and he said, I'm really sorry. It's probably rare to get a journalist to complain, but the original article had only appeared online, this very worthy, well-considered piece. And this, with some other text, was what had grabbed the headlines. So it is important to be careful. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and thank you again for inviting me, and I'm happy to take questions or have a discussion.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. We do have a question from an audience member who asks what your opinion is on using bioart to communicate science.
What is bioart? Is that like pictures taken down a microscope? Or what kind of thing are you thinking of?
Let's see if he gives a clarification. You can also unmute, Roberto, if you would like to have a discussion, or you can type it in the chat.
I'm really intrigued.
Maybe while we, more than that, sometimes it involves using live organisms, apparently.
Well, my only live organism experience was the bees, and I wasn't happy with that because, well, A, it didn't look very artistic to me, and B, you know, a number of bees died in the process. So for me, you know, using cells, using images of cells or images of protein structures is fine, but I personally would not be keen to use live organisms. And you know, artists or actors always say you shouldn't perform with live animals if possible. So that's probably a good way of thinking about it.
Okay, we have another question, and it's, can you explain what was the graded issues with the CFS CME study? Were you collecting data or diary on lived experience of patients, which was not consistent with the people who read the research?
So if you Google PACE trial, you will get the whole backstory, and it was well before my time at the MRC. But at the time, the concept was, these are often people who've been confined to bed for, or really had very restricted lives for a long time. And it was simply to record in a psychiatric study whether patients who were encouraged to do exercise had better outcomes in terms of feeling better or recovering than those that did not. And so the bone of contention was that the trial found that patients who did some graded exercise did better, and that the certain members of the patient community rejected that because they felt that this disease has has a different basis. For example, quite young people will come down with this disease maybe after an episode of a viral infection. My personal view is that CFS CME describes symptoms rather than which could have multiple causes. But the thing is that over the years, we now accept that, but they kept going back to this clinical trial. They tried to go to court to have the identity of the reviewers of the original proposal exposed. And as I said, they launched a campaign of hate on some of the investigators, which led one of them to leave the field and another one to retire early. So it was really science communication gone bad, I would say.
And so I also have a couple questions. Thankfully, my PI is very supportive of, communicating science and presenting to the public or younger students or other things like that. But I imagine that maybe all aren't so focused on it. So what's some advice that you could give for graduate students or postdocs looking to, better their science communication skills or reach out to the public? How would you suggest that they go about doing that?
Of course, not all PIs are equally enthusiastic about it. But I'd be very surprised if there isn't some activity somewhere on your campus. And so I would just take the opportunity to participate. It might be an evening event. It might be it might be something that's happening over a weekend. And there's so many different ways to do it that you can probably get the experience without annoying your PI if your PI is against it. But what I found is actually sometimes it's the graduate students who are hesitant, not the other way around. And sometimes it can be a language issue or a cultural issue. And I remember being very surprised that one of I have a very able computational scientist, and when I was doing his annual review, asking what he wanted to achieve, he said, I would like to do public engagement, but I'm too shy. So, just knowing that and working out what thing he would like to do is good. And there's so much stuff online that I really think that you can do a lot. We do, one of our graduate students does a lot of TikTok stuff. You can do that in 15 seconds. Start your own YouTube channel or have your own Instagram. I think those are things you can do.
Yeah, I think those are also great like the world is so connected now. So those are great avenues to reach out. So we have a couple more questions that rolled in. The first one is, what would you say your PhD helped with your opportunity to serve as an oral witness? Might it have been different with your combined experience and not having a PhD?
I don't think that my PhD per se really helped with that. It was more that I suppose because actually at the time I was often in the media talking about stem cell research, because I mean, to be honest, I was trying to promote what our research was, or commenting on other people. That would have attracted the attention of the civil servants who were looking for expert witnesses. So it wasn't my PhD. It was more that I was kind of well known for talking about stem cell research. And I have to say, the first time when I had to give evidence about work on human embryos, I was sort of forced into it, because the head of a funding agency called me up and he said, you better get out there and volunteer to do that. And he called a whole lot of us so that we all stood up to be counted. It's easy just to ignore those opportunities.
Yeah. And then there's another question also that came in that was, it was great that you supported Jessie and her acknowledged her dynamic experience. How might other people get experience in similar situations? So she had science experience and also loved poetry. So how did she get to work with you, I guess?
It's a very good question, because one problem about science communication is that it's become a kind of profession. And I interviewed Jess with a professional, and for me, she was just radiant. It was, her passion was clear, but I remember he said, well, if you're going to hire her, she's going to need a lot of training. And then he tried to bill me for a certain amount of money to put her on a training course. And I just wouldn't do that, because I knew, because I had the grant, I knew what needed to be done. And it's sad actually that, you know, we at King's, we do have good science engagement, but some of the people who were hired specifically to do that have lost their jobs, because it's the job that gets cut when universities are feeling the pinch. And so Jess is protected because she's on my grants, and she's completely a member of the lab. She's at all of our lab meetings. She gives presentations. And I would have thought, if I were, you know, hiring her, I'm sure that we will lose her to a better job at some point, because she is so respected. But I would definitely try and find and grow another Jess. So somebody who, many scientists just love art, or they love dancing, they like improv stuff, and just giving someone the space to do whatever they want. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of the artist Banksy. He's an anonymous graffiti artist, and Jess called me one day just before Christmas a couple of years ago, and she said, Banksy wants to auction a piece of art. I know people in his studio. He wants to weigh this art very precisely, and it's going to go to I don't know, the winner is the person who guesses the weight. So, you know, other people would have said, no, I don't want to do that. But you know, I trust Jess completely, and it was all very top secret until the thing was revealed. But just being open to those experiences is really good.
Okay. A message of thanks. popped in. And I know we're getting close to time, so if anyone has any last minute questions, they can throw them in the chat box. I know AIOG as a whole and me personally are both super appreciative that we were able to get your talk. The recording will be available online, so that will be very cool as well for anyone that was unable to attend today. We'll also put out a short blog post about it to increase our science communication skills. So thank you very much, Dr. Watt.
On that subject, you've got to send me the link, because Jess helped me put this presentation together. And after the last one, she said, "How did your talk go?" And I said it was a complete disaster. And it was, I said, "No, it was just the internet. We're going to try again." So she would love to know to what extent I did a good job or screwed up. So
yes, absolutely. Of course, we would be happy to share the link with you. It'll probably be posted either later this week or early next week, just so when we can get the video editing done.
Brilliant. Well, you're doing a great job. So keep up the good work. And it's a pleasure meeting you.
Yes, pleasure meeting you as well. Thank you so much. Have a good one, everyone.
All right. Bye.